Well, I welcome you to Gettysburg National Military Park. I'm Ranger Chuck Teague, and we're on the part of the battlefield which is not often seen, not often visited, but is very important, I think, to the battle. Sometimes it's seen like, well, it's sort of a sideshow to the battle, what happens with cavalry. But I want to emphasize that cavalry is very important. It's one of the three main branches with infantry and artillery, and what the cavalry does is crucial to any battle, and both commanders well understood that. The role or mission, the tasking of the cavalry varied. In fact, obviously they're mobile because they're on horseback, so they can move better. They're used for various purposes, sometimes raiding to the rear of an enemy position, sometimes to screen an army on the move, sometimes to demonstrate and confuse, sometimes to scout and try to find where enemy forces might be. And when you get onto a battlefield, they'll have distinct responsibilities, which will include guarding the line of operations, crucial for each army. They have an umbilical cord, a spine maybe is a better way to put it, which is got to be protected, and that's the line of operations, and cavalry is used for that. And they're also used on the flank because they can become more quickly aware of any enemy maneuvers and alert their own commander to that. They are often put on the flank. In fact, standard operating procedure in an army in the Civil War is when you get on a battlefield and when you become engaged, you have about a third of your cavalry forces on your right flank, about a third on your left flank, and about a third guarding that, very important line of operations to the rear. Cavalry in the early parts of the war, particularly in the East, was very much the reign of the Confederates and the great Cavalier. We have a guy named J.E.B Stuart who is a West Pointer, and boy, he is dashing and he is very effective. He's inspiring, he's audacious, he's very close to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee actually was the superintendent at West Point when J.E.B Stuart was a student there. They got to know each other. Both come from the Virginia culture. They're very close in their values and very much aligned in terms of their audacious way that they will fight. And we're going to be giving a lot of attention to J.E.B Stuart today. Normally, cavalry will try to operate in areas which are suitable for horses. So obviously you get in rocky ground, you get in some woody ground and along rivers and things. It's very difficult to operate with horses. But when you get out into open ground, and you can see here, very much open ground here, it's very much facilitates the use of cavalry. Cavalry on the march will, of course, like the infantry and artillery, use the road systems, but once they get into a position, they will spread out into the fields. All, of course, three branches will do that. Before we get to the ground here and what happens here, by way of introduction, a few characters, one of which is Alf Pleasanton. Alf Pleasanton is the chief of cavalry for the Union forces, for the Army of the Potomac. He works for George Meade. He's not truly a commander. He will not be in direct command, although orders will be given through him to the cavalry forces by George Meade. He's fairly egotistical. He's not quite totally reliable. He really likes to pad his own resume, making himself look good, although we see, in looking back from history, that he probably was not the best man for the position. But he is the key guy for the Union forces here, Alf Pleasanton. He's 38 years of age. Under him will be three divisions, and George Meade has just reorganized his cavalry to create three parts, and very depthly so. And he will have his division, second division, under a gentleman who's going to be important here, which is David McMurtry Gregg. David Gregg is, I think, one of the unsung heroes of this battle. He's a very important character in what happens out here. He's commanding about a third of the Union forces that are mounted, the cavalry, and but he's not the one who seeks the headlines. He's not trying to get influence in Washington. He's just a guy who's seeking to do his job. He's actually related to our governor here in Pennsylvania, Andrew Curtin, again, so many people come to Gettysburg and leave here and never hear of David McMurtry Gregg. But what he does here is really deserving of attention. He will have 2 brigades under him, and a brigade by this time in the war is going to be roughly 1,400 men. And he will also have operational control over another brigade that's not actually technically under his chain of command. And we're going to talk about how that happens to be. But that's a character we've already been chatting about as we gathered here, and that's going to be George Armstrong Custer. Custer was a West Pointer and very audacious. He's cut out of somewhat the same cloth as the J.E.B Stuart. He would do things that just astonishing. He actually had been technically a first lieutenant several days before the Battle of Gettysburg, and George Meade threw Alf Pleasanton said, "I want sharp people commanding my units in the cavalry." And so 2 captains and this first lieutenant were promoted. The other 2, Elon Farnsworth and Wesley Merritt and Custer, and I've never heard of a case where a lieutenant becomes a general overnight. But this shows again what Meade has been given the authority to promote anyone in his army he wants to reorganize it as he deems fit. And he will do it. What he does, of course, initially on the field of battle, we'll have Buford and the advance of his left column, and Buford will be engaged on July 1st. We're not going to be talking about that, but it tells us another role of cavalry. They can be dismounted, and dismounted can fire spread out with carbines, which they can fire more quickly because they're not muzzle loaded, they're breech loaded. John Buford will be leaving the afternoon of July 2nd with his division, and they basically go back to refit in Maryland and basically become the force that will be in reserve behind when the 2 other divisions will move up. One division again will be David Mercury Gregg, another one will be Judson Kilpatrick, and they'll move up. Now, I want to show this, and it's going to be perhaps difficult, but you can get a sense of it. This is a copy, a rather poor copy, but it's a copy of a Confederate map after this battle. And what I've done is colorized by putting the yellow, the road system. The road network, which is almost like a spider's web, it's going to be very important because, again, cavalry will primarily be moving on roads until they move into position. And as often has been expressed, Gettysburg is the hub of roads, spokes going out in multiple directions. This is shading, which is from a poor copy here, but down here you can see dark places on the map. Those dark places indicate woods. You've got the Round Top, you've got Culp's Hill, you've got Wolf's Hill, and those are places that cavalry just do not operate well in. However, over here, east of the town of Gettysburg and east of the main battlefield, it is wide open. And today you can actually see pretty much how wide open it is, although it would have been even more wide open back then. I'll show you at several points where you could see better then than you could see now. Looking off in the distance, you see tree lines which obscure your view. Now, if you're on your tippy toes and you're looking along this ridge line, this, by the way, is called Crest Ridge, and the Rummel Woods, which is a historic wood lot off to the right. Off in the distance is Round Top. And on your tiptoes, follow down the edge of the woods. Can you see something peeking up over the top? Some of you can. That is Round Top. That will be the left of the Union line. It gives us a sense of how the battlefield holds itself together. We're roughly about 3 miles east of the main battlefield here, and even farther from Round Top. But Round Top was given that name because from miles around, in multiple directions, you could see it. The important thing I want to point out is where we'll be going. It says Rummel here. Robert E. Lee actually had better maps coming into this battle than George Meade did. He's in enemy territory, but he plans to be in enemy territory. And Jed Hotchkiss, it's a 2nd Corps map maker, has been instructed to present him maps that will take him into Pennsylvania. And although the topography is not well represented here, you do actually have a number of places where homesteads are mentioned, and this little purple spot here will be the Rummel Homestead. The Rummel Homestead we'll be seeing in a little bit is not far from here, less than a mile from this location, so it gives us an idea where we are. On this wide open area of ground where cavalry could operate. Now, we're going to talk about why the action will happen here. Initially, George Meade had cavalry on his right, and he would be ordering cavalry up to his left. There would be an action here involving troops on both sides on the late afternoon evening of July 2nd. And as you look out in the distance, you can barely see the ridge line out there. That's about 3 miles, maybe, well, no, about 2 miles out there in the distance. That's Brinkerhoff's Ridge. J.E.B Stuart has arrived late. And he will arrive and he will have an opportunity to venture out into this part of the field to watch what's going to happen. Let me introduce him. He's one of the characters who probably needs little introduction because he is so famous. J.E.B Stuart, as I mentioned, had been to West Point while Lee was superintendent there, was from Virginia, and was just the dandy cavalier. He had, earlier in this war, continually embarrassed, humiliated the Union forces. He would literally ride in circles around the Union Army. However, his first real challenge would be in what we know as the Gettysburg Campaign. In fact, early on, he's caught off guard at one point, and he's going to have a grand review and press the old man, General Lee. And as he's preparing for that, the Yankees are actually going to make a probe, which is going to catch him off guard. And indeed, probably going to be a wake-up moment for him that the Union cavalry is not what it had been before. And then Lee will give him, and this is a pun if you didn't pick it up, leeway given to J.E.B Stuart to come up here in orders that are somewhat confusing, because what Lee does is tell him he has several different missions to do, which will include disrupting and raiding, which will include screening, which will also include coming up on the right of the Confederate Army into Pennsylvania. It will include also scouting and telling him when the Union Army has crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. J.E.B Stuart will actually take what I call the Grand Circuit route to get to Gettysburg. He will completely detach himself from the Confederate Army. He'll actually take a swing around toward Washington, pick up a wagon train of supplies, about 150 wagons, of which he probably captured about 125, including food and forage for his horses, which is a good thing. Although he's also tearing up telegraph lines and disrupting channels for the canals and various things he's doing, as well as raiding. And then when he finally gets up to Pennsylvania, he can't find his own army. And he will take a circuit which will take us east through Hanover and over toward York, Dover, up toward Dillsburg, Pennsylvania, finally getting to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is well north of us, and then only then discover where the Confederate Army is. So his forces will not be available for this battle until July 3rd. There are actually 7 brigades in Confederate cavalry, but the 3 crack ones he took with him, the ones that really trained in cavalry action. The others are sort of dismounted infantry, and they can move from place to place on horses. But if you want something really effectively and astutely done, you would use one of those 3 crack brigades that he took with him. When he gets to Gettysburg, he meets with Robert E. Lee, the commanding general, in a meeting which we don't know much about. We do know that J.E.B Stuart's adjutant says that it was a meeting painful beyond description, this awkwardness, because some would argue that Robert E. Lee did not have his eyes and ears coming into battle, and he was expecting that from J.E.B Stuart. We also know that Robert E. Lee's military secretary, Charles Marshall, said that this man, J.E.B Stuart, ought to have been court-martialed and shot. That's pretty strong language. So obviously there were some strong passions about what had happened and what should have happened, what didn't happen. But once he gets here, Robert E. Lee again will send him out here to scout out the ground, and he will again, from Brinkerhoff's Ridge, watch some action on the evening of July 2nd, and also see how this ground is very suitable for cavalry action. It'll have open fields, but it'll also have scattered woodlots. Woodlots where you could hide your men, you could conceal them, and then move them out when you wanted to. And it has some degree of rollingness to it. Again, what we're on right now is called Crest Ridge, and you can see how it tails down in that direction toward the Hanover Road and toward the Baltimore Pike further on. He will have with him Robert E. Lee's son's own brigade, although his son, Robert E. Lee's son, has been captured, and so now that is going to be commanded by John Chambliss, Colonel Chambliss. Just weeks before, again, when the Union cavalry was doing their stuff, Robert E. Lee's son was captured. John Chambliss will be here, as well as Wade Hampton. Wade Hampton's one of my favorites, probably the richest man in the Confederate armies. He was a plantation owner, but a man with not only great means, but great stuff. and he would be commanding in battle and leading troops here. He was a Virginian. And then thirdly, you have Fitzleahy. This is a Lee, but it's not a son, it's a nephew. But he's also bringing Virginia troops up. So he has these three, and he's going to be given another brigade for the purposes of the action on July 3rd. When his men get in here, they are tuckered out because of the long route that they gave. Fitzlee said, "We were almost broken down from want of rest." And a sergeant in the 2nd Virginia Cavalry said, "We were worn out with hard service and want of sleep." There were supposed anecdotal stories told about cavalrymen that fall out of the saddle and they don't even wake up till they hit the ground, because it had been a long and exhausted trip. And the horses pretty much were fagged too, which is a word meaning they were exhausted, and some of them were dropping on the march because of the demand that was made on them. Usually horses, you may drive them for 2, maybe 3 days, and you give them a day off, and these horses weren't getting much day off. Anyway, he sees this ground over good, and he has talked to Robert E. Lee, and Robert E. Lee will say, "Take your 3 crack brigades," amounting at this point to about 5,500 men. At the start of the campaign, closer to 6,000, perhaps it started, but with the addition of another brigade, he'll have at least 5,500 men to come over here. Now, normally, as I said, you put a third of your army on your cavalry on the left of your army, a third on your right, and a third to your rear. What Robert E. Lee does here is astounding. He keeps cavalry resources to his rear, guiding his line of operations. It's very important that that keep open. And some will be coming forward as available. One was on the left flank. But now as they get into battle formation, his left flank will be taken, his left wing over here, will be taken over by 4 brigades. About 5,500 men. How many cavalrymen will he have on the other side, on his right flank? Well, about 100. And this is going to be a ragtag bunch of guys that are hodgepodge that are just sort of drawn together. Already you understand Robert E. Lee is doing something audacious. To put 5,500 troopers on one side and only 100 on the other tells us this is not standard operating procedure. And of course this is Robert E. Lee. He'll be doing things a little differently. So again, we have these 3 crack guys, Fitzlee and Chambliss and Wade Hampton. And then on the night of July 2nd into the morning of July 3rd, the Union forces, cavalry, is actually going to be shifted down farthest to the south to the Baltimore Pike. And then on the morning of July 1st, orders are going to be given for 2 of those brigades to be moving actually to the left wing, and 2 others were having temporary responsibilities over on this side. This map here is that same diagram I showed you earlier, the map of the roads. I've cleaned it up a little bit. And you can see blue indicates where Union forces will be, and the red indicates Confederate forces moving into place. This is the Baltimore Pike. This is the Hanover Road. This is the York Pike. Keep those 3 roads in mind. And again, this is the town of Gettysburg, and where the Union Army is going to be primarily over in this area here. So we have initially Jenkins and Chambliss being coming over here. Jenkins is not with his men. We call it Jenkins' Brigade, but he was actually wounded the day before and did not participate as Lee intended. He will be, well, we're not even sure exactly who was taking over for him, because a Colonel Wister or Colonel Ferguson was actually commanding them here. But they were clearly the kind of cavalry which were dismounted infantry. They did not have much adeptness. In fact, earlier in the campaign, there's an anecdotal report that when they were north here near Mechanicsburg, they got all worried because they could see there were fresh entrenchments that had been built along a ridge line where they were heading, and the panic began to spread that they were going to come under attack. And it was only later they discovered they were graves that were being dug for a civilian cemetery, and thought that they were something far more fierce. So again, I'm not sure how much attention should be given to the prowess of General Jenkins, but he will be the first one in, or his men will be in, and he will be injured. And Chambliss will be coming up behind, and they're going to be coming up beyond these woods right here, the Rummel Woods here, and into position. The other 2 remember Fitz Lee and Wade Hampton, those two brigades had been heavily, well, not heavily, but they had been significantly involved in action July 2nd at a place called Hunterstown. Sometimes we call it North Cavalry Field. And they had been clipped from the rear by a young brigadier from the Union forces. Turned out it would be George Armstrong Custer, who almost lost his life there. By the way, several times in this campaign, he's going to lose a horse and yet still be on about his work himself. That will happen. He's lost his horse in that battle. But because there actually are casualties sustained up there, Chambliss comes forward. Those two, Wade Hampton and Fitz Lee's brigades, are going to bivouac more up by Hunterstown and deal with the losses that they've had there. So you actually have a detachment of the forces that J.E.B Stuart has, and they're not all co-located as we begin the day of July 3rd. He comes here, and why is he coming here? Well, obviously he's protecting the flank. I mean, that's a standard operating procedure, although with 5,500 men. Stuart says, I hoped to effect a surprise on the enemy's rear. He said he came to a commanding ridge. This is the ridge that you see right here, a commanding ridge which looks off into the distance. And he said the ridge had a view of the routes leading to the enemy's rear. Now understand what the rear of an army is. The rear is that umbilical cord, or that line of operations I've been talking about, which is so important and extends for the Union Army. That rear extends all the way back to Westminster, Maryland. That's where the wagon park is, where the medical supplies, commissary of supplies are. And if there had to be a fallback of the Union forces, that could supply a new position at a place called Pipe Creek. So that line of operations that goes down the Baltimore Pike, next road is Hanover, beyond that is Baltimore Pike, is the rear of the Union Army. McClellan, one of his aides, says that he sought an opportunity to get into the rear of the enemy. And actually I've come up with several other accounts that verify this too. This is not standard operating procedure on a flank that you're protecting to get into the rear of the enemy. And indeed, another officer in his, under his command said, the intent was to flank the enemy's army and to cut off its way of retreat. Now, what was the Union Army's way of retreat? It would be the Baltimore Pike. Lee has fought the Union Army time and time again with great success, but always the Union Army got away, and always they came back to fight another day. Lee was discouraged after the Battle of Fredericksburg, great victory for the Confederates, but he was discouraged because he hadn't gained an inch of ground, he lost a lot of good men, and the war continued. The Battle of Chancellorsville, one of the great victories that anyone in history has had, Robert E. Lee had against the Union forces. They were routed, they left, but again, he was discouraged, according to his own account post-war, because he hadn't gained any ground, and the war was not any closer to being over after those victories. He wants a decisive victory. In fact, he tells one of his generals en route to Gettysburg, he doesn't know it's going to be Gettysburg, but coming here, that he wants to ruin the Union Army. He tells another one he wants to destroy the Union Army. There are 300 major battles in this war, and rare is the case which a defeated army is ruined. They almost always, virtually always, get away. So it's very important if Robert E. Lee is going to have a decisive battle and not have to just fight another battle and then another battle and another battle, realizing the resources of the North and manpower and materiel are much greater than the South has, he can't have these Pyrrhic victories where he's winning but he's really losing. So understand Robert E. Lee wanting to do something very audacious, and he has now, after several days being gone, he has J.E.B Stuart. What we're going to do is to set up the positions. But as we do, I'll just point out, this woodlot here would have existed at the time of the battle. That's historic. Although woodlots were different back then than they are now. You could actually easily walk through a woodlot. Cows would roam through woodlots and they chew up the lower grasses and shrubs and even chew off leaves from the branches. And farmers, when they would need wood, would often cut lower branches off. So it had more of a picnic grove appearance than we see today. There's the woods there, and then there's a woods right here by where you're parked. That's going to be the Rummel Woods, and our next stop is going to be down where we can see the Rummel Homestead. And understand, when J.E.B Stuart gets here, I'm thinking he's arriving about 8 o'clock in the morning. 4:45 is sunrise, and we have accounts from his men that they were roused early and put on the march. And he only has maybe 3 miles to travel, so I think certainly probably by 8 o'clock he's arriving. And he gets to this ridge line, and what he sees is interesting, and what he does is even more interesting. Are you ready? All right. mount up and let's go. We're at a corner of the Rummel Woods and looking at the Rummel barn, the white barn there, and a post-war house. The stone house is post-war. But that's going to be a homestead which is going to be in the middle of this field, which is going to be very important to understand because the initial part of the battle will be right in the fields right in front of you. Again, the ridge line that we've been coming from through the woods, this is the corner, and there actually was a farm lane that initially came up through those woods. It does not exist today. The paved roads that you see out here are not historic. There are park avenues that have been put here for your convenience, but often confuse people as to where the position of the units were at the time. My belief is about 8:30, and I'm going to orient this to the compass here, well actually to our location. This is the woodlot that we passed along back there, and the other woodlot I talked about initially over here. And we've come down along this way. They would have probably come through this road through the woods there, and he had some guns, one of which he pulled out to probably this point of woods approximately right here. My sense from my research is that what he intended to do to get to the Union rear is to use several roads, which include the Hoffman Road, which is just out of view beyond here. However, if you can look in the distance, you can see a silo and you can see the top of a barn. That is actually on the Hoffman Road. You can also perhaps make out one up in that direction. Hoffman Road is going to be a historic road, which is just beyond where we are. And I think that his intent is to use that road to get to the Hanover Road, and then another road or two to get from the Hanover Road to the Baltimore Pike. When he arrives here, he again sees this open ground. He also wonders what he shall do, and he pulls out one cannon. And without explaining what he does, probably right where we are here, he fires that cannon in several different directions. Now his adjutant who's with him speculated it was a signal. We do know that Robert E. Lee used signal guns several times during the battle. When you're talking about long distance where a courier would have to go from one place to another and might break a leg, the horse, or he might get lost, the courier. Cannon fire can't communicate a lot, but it can communicate instantly. Others have disputed that, but I think it's plausible. Some say he was intending to flush out the Yankees that were here, as if they're quail in these fields. Well, you can flush quail, but the natural human instinct when you have been fired upon is to hunker down and to hide out and not to go out and expose yourself. So that never made much sense to me. I think that the conjecture by the aide that it was a signal was probably what was intended. That fire, I think, was going to go out about 8:30 in the morning. One thing about it, though, when you hear a gun being fired on the battlefield today with reenactors, or maybe in a movie, you're not getting a sense as to what it was then. First of all, the sound of these guns was very loud. Secondly, they made distinctive sounds depending on what was being fired, if it's from a smoothbore, from a rifle. And the third question was, when it's being fired, what are you hearing as far as the projectile going through the air? This is a crucial thing to understand because there's going to be a whir or a whine or a buzz as it goes through the air. And in fact, you're going to have what's sometimes called the Doppler effect. The Doppler effect is where you have like a train coming towards you and the sound of the train varies as it's coming towards you as opposed to going away from you. So what we have here, if you're firing in different directions and you have a trained ear, it's going to sound odd. First of all, you can hear it going in multiple different directions, but also the Doppler effect, when it's coming near you, different, you're going to realize this is a strange thing. If he did fire 3 or 4 times, as I think he did, and fired off in multiple directions, that would be to a trained ear 3 miles away, tuning him to something was up. Now, what would he try to communicate? I think he was communicating that he was in place, that he'd gotten to where he needed to be to support the larger plan. General Lee talks about a general plan of battle, and that general plan of battle will encompass infantry and artillery, and will encompass cavalry. I mentioned the gun here, they're horse artillery, which goes with the cavalry. They're typically rifled guns, and they are able to go at much more mobility typically than other guns that will be with the infantry. But anyway, he does this, I think, and again, 8:39. What is Lee planning that day? Well, we know that he's planning the assault, which came to be known as Pickett's Charge. And we also know that Lee intended this offensive action to start in the morning. And if he is going to be dislodging, his word, Lee's word, dislodging the Union Army from the hill, the Cemetery Hill, and they will then be routed, he's got to make sure that they just don't escape. And so if we have J.E.B Stuart here, open fields heading toward Hanover Road and the Baltimore Pike, where he could get down there, he would be able to, in good time, enhance the opportunity for a real success in this battle. Lee will actually be planning an action which will involve 1st Artillery, 2nd Infantry, and 3rd Cavalry. This is the piece that he didn't have the day before, but he has now. 5,500 men over here who can advance to the rear, to the Baltimore Pike, and if getting there can completely bottle up any retreat by the Union Army. So again, my suggested map with the north at the top here, this would be where we are right now, and this is the intended route from the Hoffman Road in the distance. Anytime you're on the move, you want to make sure that you're not vulnerable to any attack coming in, and skirmishers will be put off coming across from the Hoffman Road, coming across these fields here to protect from any action that's be coming from the other direction. However, as I mentioned, the other 2 brigades under General Stuart are not here yet. They were delayed because of the casualties, licking their wounds from the action at Hunterstown, and they actually will be coming up, I think, later than Stuart intended or thought. I think he expected them to be close behind, but it's only going to be about 11 o'clock before they will be moving in, Hampton and Fitz-Lee. Hampton will take a position in those woods, Fitz-Lee will take a position in those woods. But in the meantime, you have Union forces. You can't see them from here today because, again, of the intervening trees, but you have Union forces coming up on the Hanover Road under George Armstrong Custer. And it's interesting because Custer was supposed to have gone to the other side of the field. He was supposed to go to the left wing. Why did Custer break off and stay over here against orders? Well, first of all, he did have the concurrence of David McMurtry Gregg, said, "I'd like to have you over here." But I can only speculate at this point that if that signal gun went off, not only was Robert E. Lee hearing that, but the Union were hearing that and suspecting something might be up. And I think David McMurtry Gregg, concerned about the possibility, says to Custer, "Can you stay over here?" Because his other 2 brigades had moved actually in the Baltimore Pike toward the town and was leaving a vulnerability out here. So around 11 o'clock, Custer forms up down there, and he actually sends skirmishers off in the field, and then what begins is a counter battery fire. We have guns, you've seen some depicted along here. Confederate guns will move forward. Unfortunately today you cannot have the sight lines that they had back then, but in the Civil War you only fired on what you could see. And we know that these guns were firing on those guns and those guns were firing back, so at the time they could see each other. And so the first significant stage of this action out here involves skirmishers in these fields and counter battery fire. And at that point the Union guns are getting the best, quite the best of it. And in fact the Confederate guns are going to have to be pulled back. In the meantime, of course, since things are developing up there, David McMurtry Gregg has ordered a McIntosh's brigade out there further to deal with it. And Custer is supposed to go on to join his division commander. So about 12 o'clock, what you'll have, again, skirmishing among the here, and Chambliss, by the way, will augment Ferguson's men out, or Worcester's men out here in the field. And then you have Custer, who starts to leave, and then he asks David McMurtry Gregg, "You know, I think the woods up there are full of rebels." He can't see them yet, but he suspects that, and of course he had a good suspicion of that. And he says, "Do you think I can stay?" Of course, Custer was always ready for a fight. This is going to be a fight here. And we'll have the permission given. Okay, you can stay here. Not by his commander, though. Custer is really going against orders. His orders are to follow his division commander, Judson Kilpatrick, to the left wing, and he doesn't do that. Sometimes disobeying orders is a bad thing. Sometimes it turns out to be a good thing. And I think here at Gettysburg we'll see it may have been a very good thing that he stays over here. So you have McIntosh, you see the woods over there. McIntosh forming over there, Custer down by the Baltimore Pike, and you have these guns, Union guns set up here, firing back and forth between Confederate positions on the ridge where we are and Union positions down there. Things are escalating. That's a word we used in the Vietnam War, escalation. This is a day of escalation, and each side will do more and more. If the only mission that J.E.B Stuart had was to defend the left of the Union, left of the Confederate forces, there's no reason he would put men out in open fields that would be in danger of being struck. But the fact that he does suggests he's up to something more. And he tells us it's to get into the Union rear. So again, this is happening about noon, and then developments will continue. We're going to make 2 more stops to see how this absolutely grows to a phenomenal level of action and involving cavalry. In fact, a lot of casualties for cavalry. Questions? All right. All right, let's review where we were and where we are now. See the line of trees at the horizon over there? That's the ridge line where we were originally. We're now seeing the Rummel homestead from another direction. Again, the house is post-war, beautiful home. The white barn, though, was here during the time of the battle. And initially we have, coming from our left to the right, we have Confederate skirmishers crossing over under Worcester or Ferguson, crossing from left to right. And we have then, again, Custer, who's pulled up. He will bring skirmishers from the right up. And what you have is a back and forth with skirmishers. Although these are cavalrymen, they are not mounted at this point. There are some disadvantages that the Confederates will soon have. Again, Worcester's men, Ferguson's men, they will run out of ammunition. Chambliss, who was actually up there beyond the house and barn, he will move out to take positions here, but the Union forces will be augmented by 2 regiments from Michigan that have repeaters. The only repeaters here, the 5th and 6th Michigan, Buford did not have repeaters. And actually these were rifles that they were paid for by the state of Michigan. They were not the standard issue that Union cavalry would receive. They're expensive, and the attitude in the War Department in Washington was, well, if we give our troops repeaters, they'll waste the ammunition and they'll be of no use on the battlefield. However, again, in this case, we have guys with repeaters, and they're rifles, so they can fire a longer range than the carbines. So they've got a double advantage really here on firing, and will drive the rebels back. And what you have during the course of the midday is back and forth, and indeed that barn becomes sort of the midpoint, which is going to be referenced by a number of the soldiers as to where the battle would rage and whether they had control of the barn. The Yankees at one point, the Confederates at another point across these fields. This is one of these tree lines that I was talking to you about. There's actually an old historic farmland along here, but you wouldn't have had this thick tree line here at the time of the battle. This is one of the things we wished we could have looked through from the ridge to look out. You'll see several of these as we cross over. This is private land. It's under conservation easement, so it will not be developed. But we can't tell them to take down trees. It's on their property. So what we do is we have historic pictures which we try to view. One which was taken up there and looking back is of this barn, and I've got red arrows. If you draw closer here, you can see the red arrows indicate monuments that could be seen that we'll get to down there. And so from the other side of the barn in the middle of the 19th century, you could see down there. Today you can't. And again, with the counter battery fire, they could see each other. We can't today. It was much more open. But again, things will escalate. We're going to go to the final location where we're going to talk about the incredible attacks. But let me point out initially an attack that's going to go in about 3:30. Again, obviously J.E.B Stuart is not simply protecting the flank. He will send 2 crack Virginia brigades actually from Fitz-Lee out of the woods to the right there, and he will send them charging across these fields, thundering across. We're talking at this point maybe 600 horsemen. I have only been as close to about a dozen horses at a time that were galloping, and that was at Churchill Downs years ago when I was on the rail. But my point is, my heart practically jumped out of my chest. To imagine, say, 600 horsemen galloping across the field, thunderously across, would be extraordinary. And so what we have here is the attempt to do that roughly about 3:30, which, by the way, is when during the time Pickett's charge was going on, about 3:30. Coming across but being thwarted particularly by two guns, Chester's pieces, two pieces, a section of Union guns that had moved up. And we're going to see their location and why they're going to make such a difference. The Confederate guns had already been pretty much smashed out on the ridgeline there. The Union guns are coming even more into play as this action continues on. You're going to see two brigades here, McIntosh and Custer, also now coming up with Irvin Gregg. He's another brigade under David McMurtry Gregg. And actually what he's done coming there is to thwart any possibility of J.E.B Stuart using the Hoffman Road. That is out, no possibility. But what we have is J.E.B Stuart determined to fight on and to fight harder than he's even fought before. And we're going to see that at our next stop. The attack that was made that I spoke of earlier, cavalry across these fields, was a phenomenal thing. William Miller of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry said, "A more determined and vigorous charge than that made by the 1st Virginia, it was never my fortune to witness." This is one cavalryman, one trooper from one side, speaking with respect to those of another. And then there would be a countercharge in the face of that, which would be directed by David McMurtry Gregg and undertaken by George Armstrong Custer. That would be involving the 7th Michigan. Custer, by the way, on his saber, I don't have one, but on the saber, on the sheath was, on the saber itself was written, "Draw me not without provocation, sheath me not without honor." That every time he would draw that out, he expected something to happen. So we have two regiments of Confederates. Again, a regiment would be about 300, crossing the fields from left to right. And then out from the right, we have, coming back, Custer with his. Behind us, we have actually some Union guns. It's hard to pick out where they would be, but there's an orchard. If you step here just a little bit further, see in the crest of that second ridge there, there's some small trees representing an orchard. That's where Chester's gun sections were brought up. And those guns are going to be very important. It appears that what will happen is that the Confederates are trying to seize those guns because they've been perplexing them throughout this action. Although offenses with that meat will cause problems in trying to do that. The Rummel Woods, again, we're up there, but you'll see the Lot Woods over there. That's where McIntosh is going to be with his forces out there waiting. And then Custer is going to be down further down here. And farther out to the west will be where McIntosh's brigade will be. Well, you're going to continue to have charges. By the way, Custer will say, "Come on, you Wolverines!" Of course, he is just now 3 days into commanding these guys. And describing the clash that will occur in the fields out there, Major Trowbridge, the United States officer, said, "Like waves of the sea upon the struggling mass in front, until all were mixed in one confused and tangled mess." Well, J.E.B Stuart is not going to stop with that. Obviously, that attack was stymied, so he will, again, pull out all the stops pretty much for another attack. This is not a defensive operation on the part of J.E.B Stuart. He is attacking and attacking. And the charge of the 9th and 12th Virginia under Chambliss, plus the 1st North Carolina, plus the Jeff Davis Legion under Hampton will be coming, and they'll come across this field yelling like demons as they're coming. Of course, you had the Confederate yell, which was used by infantry, but of course it would also be used by cavalry coming across there. The 7th Michigan had fallen back under destructive fire coming back, and the Yankees will respond with more artillery fire. Custer, who got a lot of credit for himself, will say for Pennington's guns, those are the guns down there on the road, but for Pennington's guns, we would have been licked in that fight. So he acknowledges it wasn't just the horse soldiers that were making a difference here, it was the horse artillery, and the horse artillery under Pennington and also that section under Chester here. This final clash coming down, and I'll show you a map depicting this about 4:30. You can see how from Fitz Lee, from Hampton, how the charge is coming across those fields. But as they come across here, they're going to be putting their flank to McIntosh's men over there, and actually skirmishers, Union forces over there, and then of course a counterattack, another counterattack, which is being led by Custer in the face of theirs. So at this point, it is thunderous roar. By the way, we're talking about probably a couple thousand horsemen at this point. It staggers my mind to try to imagine them charging across the field there. But you can see it's become somewhat of a cul-de-sac of death, if you will, because those Confederate forces coming on are going to be fired from the front, Chester's battery, and the attack by Custer, and hit from both sides as they're coming forward. The wording that is used to describe this by men, one said, "A grander spectacle than that advance had never before been seen." Another said, "I challenge anyone," this is from the 1st Michigan, by Custer, "I challenge the annals of warfare to produce a more brilliant or successful charge of cavalry." And again, he was in his element that day, George Custer, coming across the field.
He just got out of West Point, right?
He was a very young officer, that's correct, several years.
I mean, this was really his first battle. I don't remember.
He was in previous battles as a staff officer, but not in command. He was not in command prior to Gettysburg, that's correct. The clash was like, one man said it was like the clash of falling thunder out there. Custer will lose his horse. Now, he's already lost a horse at Brandy Station. He's lost a horse at Hanover. He's lost a horse at Hunterstown. Now he's losing a horse out here. And a South Carolina trooper who was involved in this says, "The two hostile columns still together with furious clashing of swords and intermingled with the popping of pistols, horses and riders locked together with a dreadful melee, friend and foe alike fallen, all are crushed." Wow. The semblance of what was happening right out in this area here. You can see it over the top of those trees there, a monument which is pretty much hidden anymore, and those trees again weren't there at the time of the battle, and that is the cavalry column, which honors the forces from both sides that clashed there. And then right here we have the Michigan monument, which honors the forces from Michigan who would be fighting here and doing such an extraordinary job. Fitz Lee, as he's attacking across here, finds himself at the mercy of a saber-wielding Yankee. He's saved by the shot from a pistol by his adjutant. Wade Hampton received two gashes on his skull and a bullet wound in his thigh. Stuart had said, "All I ask of fate is that I may be killed leading a cavalry charge," but he was not injured in this action here. But again, a lot of soldiers down for what a cavalry action would be. The Yankees would rally and drive him back, and you have again small groups, even at one point a cluster of guys who were just not supposed to be in action and really were more couriers and aides. They want to be in the action too, and they come charging in from the side over there. Makes it very, very, very dangerous for these Confederates. They will, of course, then have to retreat. And you can see, well, now it's over a mile in the distance what they'll have to retreat back. The attack was described as by one Virginian as hand to hand, blow for blow, cut for cut, and oath for oath. But the rebels will finally fall back to Crest Ridge. Some of them will make the argument that they continue to hold the Rummel Barn through the end of the action, and so they really didn't lose over here. But that's a little bit misleading, because actually what was Stuart's mission? His mission was to reach the rear of the Union Army. He didn't. What was David McMurtry's Gregg role? It was to, of course, to protect the flank, and he well protected that flank. I want to quote as I close Lieutenant Rawls, Brooke Rawls of 3rd Pennsylvania. He, of course, is excited about what he's seen, what he's witnessed, what he's participated in. As he says, "Fortunately for us, fortunately for the Army of the Potomac, fortunately for our country, and fortunately for the cause of liberty, Stuart failed, and thank God that he did fail." Well, of course, his blood was up in this action, as others were too. Custer, I think, clearly earned his spurs here at Gettysburg for what he did in this action, and he's going to go on to more fame and fortune, and of course ultimately the death, because of how audacious he would be. Troopers on both sides would have another 10 days of very difficult action, because obviously as Pickett's charge fails, Robert E. Lee is bringing the Confederate forces, trying to get them back to cross the Potomac, and he has to rely on J.E.B Stuart. J.E.B Stuart does marvelously protecting the Confederate Army as they go back. And the Union Army will, on about 14 occasions through their cavalry, strike at Lee's forces on the retreat. But what happened this day in this place must not be forgotten, because it was very much integral to the Battle of Gettysburg. It is part of the Battle of Gettysburg, and indeed the number of casualties was high compared to what casualties usually are among the cavalry. East Cavalry Field. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.